Most quarterbacks need a great team to win. John Elway didn't have that luxury. No elite receivers, no dominant offensive line, and a system that held him back. And yet, through sheer talent, a rocket arm, and countless clutch performances, he took the Broncos further than they ever should have gone. Not because of the team around him, but in spite of it. So how did he drag the Broncos to 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, essentially by himself? There's a reason Elway was arguably the hottest draft prospect in NFL history. A rocket arm, with passes so powerful it broke his receivers' fingers. Add to that size, mobility, heck, he could even catch it. And when he retired, the numbers seemed to back it up. But despite all of that, Elway's career often gets misunderstood.
John is back, runs up out of the pocket, lets the pass go, it's caught. Johnson to the 40, 35, 30, 45, and out of bounds. Unbelievable. If I had seen it with my own eyes, I don't think I'd believe it.
I threw that clip in there because I think it might be the best way to sum up John Elway's career. Because if you didn't watch him play, you might not understand how good he actually was. And if you just look at his career stats, they don't jump out at you. They don't seem like the stats of a top 10 quarterback of all time, right? But stats without context are meaningless. So let's add some context. Because Elway's greatness isn't just that he carried the Broncos to those Super Bowls, but that he did so with so much working against him. Despite Elway's talent, the Broncos lacked playmakers on offense. That meant he didn't only have to drag bad teams, but it also made his stats look worse. Now, the defense was actually pretty good for most of his career, but right now we're just speaking offensively. Compared to the other 2 Hall of Famers of his draft class and Super Bowl quarterbacks he faced, you can see his supporting cast was noticeably weaker. So simply put, for most of his career, Elway was the Broncos offense, and that's why many people say he carried the Broncos in those early years. When he did get elite talent, at an age most quarterbacks are declining, mid to late 30s, well, at least most quarterbacks, he put up elite numbers. So I think it's fair to conclude his numbers would have been way better if he had that kind of talent early in his career. But let's dig a bit deeper into how much help he had. At running back, despite his head coach's obsession with the run, the Broncos only had a 1,000-yard rusher 4 times from 1983 to 1992. As for receiver, he only had one that surpassed 1,000 yards 3 times. As a comparison, during that same period, let's take Dan Marino, who had a receiver exceed 1,000 yards every season except for 4. And Denver also never had a tight end catch more than 31 passes in a season. If you contrast that with the numbers Shannon Sharpe would eventually put up, it's pretty revealing. Now, he had a couple seasons playing with Pro Bowl talent, but for the most part, in the first decade of his career, the talent he had was not as good as other Hall of Fame quarterbacks had. But the best evidence that the Broncos were a one-man show with John Elway came in 1992 when he got injured. The Broncos sat at 7-3 and they looked primed for another playoff run. But Elway would get injured and miss the next 4 games. The Broncos would also lose those 4 games. In the end, that actually proved to be the best thing to happen to John Elway, because if he was healthy, they would have made the playoffs, made another deep playoff run and maybe even the Super Bowl. And the owner, Pat Bowlen, later admitted he would likely have given the head coach, Dan Reeves, another contract. And that leads us onto the other reason John Elway's numbers seem so pedestrian, his head coach. When you have a prospect like John Elway, you would think you'd build the team around his strengths, rather than trying to fit him into an existing system. Well, that's what Dan Reeves tried to do. With his run-first game plan, Elway was pretty restricted. It went something like this: run on first down, run on second down, and then pray Elway will save you on 3rd and long. That's an exaggeration, of course, but Elway was so good, the rest of the team and his head coach began to expect him to save the day, which he often did, with 31 career comebacks. The most famous being the drive. Starting at the 2-yard line, he completed 6 of 8 passes for 78 yards and 20 yards with his legs, finishing it off with a 5-yard touchdown pass. The Broncos would win the coin toss in overtime and then kick a field goal to end the game. But Elway could only carry the team so much when it seemed like his coach was working against him. By the time John Elway entered the league, the rule changes in the late 70s had set up a new passing era that was perfectly suited for John Elway's talents. But Reeves was conservative. He wanted to control the ball, and his offensive scheme didn't emphasize passing as much. Case in point, Elway threw 20 touchdowns once under Dan Reeves. He never surpassed 4,000 yards. But after Dan Reeves was fired, John Elway immediately threw for over 4,000 yards in a season. And in his final 6 years, he threw for over 20 plus touchdowns in 5 of them. John Elway and Dan Reeves had a difficult relationship. Elway went as far as to describe his tenure with Reeves as, quote, hell. It got so bad that in 1991, Dan Reeves actually considered a trade for John Elway with the Redskins. I know at that point they had been blown out in 3 Super Bowls, but to trade a Hall of Fame quarterback who was still in his prime is crazy to me. The nail in the coffin came in 1992 when, instead of drafting a receiver that Elway desperately needed, Dan Reeves drafted quarterback Tommy Maddox in the 1st round.
My personal opinion is there has to be some changes, and I don't know if Dan's going to give in to that or
He's not.
So something had to give. And while Dan Reeves was eventually replaced, the Broncos still made it to 3 Super Bowls with him. But in those 3 Super Bowls, they were outscored 40 to 136 points. How did these blowouts keep getting worse every game? For one thing, unfortunately for Elway, he reached the Super Bowl during the peak of the NFC's dominance. From 1984 to 1996, they won 13 straight Super Bowls. In Super Bowl 21, they faced the Giants and were 9.5-point underdogs. The Giants' defense, led by Lawrence Taylor, was suffocating, allowing 20 points just twice that year. And going into the Super Bowl, the Giants had obliterated their playoff opponents by a combined score of 66 to 33. The Broncos, on the other hand, had barely got by the Patriots and then beat the Browns on Elway's infamous drive. But even with all that, the game started off well. The Broncos were up 10-7 in the second quarter, but then their kicker missed a 23-yard field goal, and a couple drives later Elway would be sacked for a safety. Although the score was still 10-9, momentum clearly shifted, and the Giants came out in the second half and scored 26 unanswered points. The Broncos seemed to be very fickle. If one little thing went wrong, they just collapsed. Elway played well, but not well enough. 304 yards, a touchdown, and an interception, as well as a rushing touchdown. Elway had willed the team to the Super Bowl, most notably with the drive, but one man could not overcome Belichick's defense. And as for the Broncos' defense, they didn't prove to be much help for Elway either. Phil Simms had thrown more interceptions than touchdowns that season, but against the Broncos he somehow entered flow state and threw 3 touchdowns with no interceptions. The whole team would fall apart again the following year as the Broncos made their way to back-to-back Super Bowls. Again, it was on the back of Elway, who had 3 fourth-quarter comebacks that season, but the setup was slightly different. Elway was crowned NFL MVP as the Broncos steamrolled through the playoffs to face the Redskins and backup quarterback Doug Williams. In Super Bowl 22, the Broncos started off well again, up 10-0 against the Redskins. But then the Redskins would just take over the game.
Yes, sir. We coming back. We gonna do it.
The defense would give up 35 points in 19 plays, and 3 of those 5 scores came on 50-plus yard plays. Down 35-10 in what seemed like a blink of an eye, the Broncos had no chance. Elway would keep trying to force it to claw back, and it just made things worse. The Broncos also got beat up on the ground, as Timmy Smith, a nobody at this point, would set a Super Bowl record for rushing yards in a game that still stands. So that's 2 Super Bowls, 2 humiliating losses. Elway didn't play well this game, but again, it was all him. If he didn't play perfect, and the Broncos were slightly off, this was the result. Going into their 3rd Super Bowl with Elway, the Broncos won the AFC that year with an 11-5 record, the only team in the conference to have 10-plus wins. But this time, Elway was led by the number 1 ranked defense in the league, who allowed just 14 points a game. They were set to face the number 1 offense and the number 3 defense in the San Francisco 49ers. So 2 powerhouses, right? Well no, this game was ugly, plain and simple. The biggest blowout in Super Bowl history. The 1989 49ers were just one of the greatest teams ever, and that number 1 defense of the Broncos just had no answers for the 49ers. That would put Elway and the offense in an untenable situation. It would take years for Elway to shake this court jester image that he built up over these humiliating Super Bowl losses, with his stats being pretty abysmal up to this point. Now, John Elway certainly underperformed in these games, but the reality was the Broncos were there because of John Elway, and Elway alone. So when it came to the Super Bowl against the superior NFC, the one-man show proved to not be enough.
The Denver Broncos weren't a 53-man team. They were a one-man team, and their one man was under siege once the score became somewhat one-sided.
Those 3 Super Bowls were not a true reflection of Elway's shortcomings as a player, rather a reflection of the Broncos' failures to build a competitive team.